Associate. Welcome to this HFMA's webinar. Investigating in Cybersecurity Mitigates Organization Risk and Enhance Patient Safety. Your participation is encouraged during this webinar. You may post questions or share your comments at any time during the session in the Q&A box located on your computer screen. Questions will be addressed after the webinar as time permits. For audio, dial 844-522-4080, conference code 622-531#. Guest PIN 5618. If you have problems hearing the presentation, you may comment in the Q&A box and our staff will reply as soon as possible. In order to receive CPE credit for your attendance for this session, you must submit checkpoints that will appear on your computer screen during the session and complete the online session evaluation. Also, please be advised that this session is being recorded. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker. Jackie Munson is Vice President, Chief Privacy and Information Security Officer at Sutter Health. Jackie Munson has worked in healthcare for 16 years. For the last 14 years, Jackie has focused primarily on compliance, privacy, and information security. Currently, Jackie is the Vice President, Chief Privacy and Information Security Officer for Sutter Health, where she provides direction and oversight for all phases of the privacy and information security program. Jackie is considered a subject matter expert and leader in compliance, privacy, and information security. Previously, Jackie has served as a member of HHS Healthcare Industry Cybersecurity Task Force. She has testified before government and legislative committees, authored numerous articles, and is frequent national speaker of these subjects. Jackie has a Juris Doctor from Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. Joshua Corman is the founder of IamCavalry.org. He previously served as the CSO for PTC, Director for Cyber Statecraft Initiative for the Atlantic Council, CTO for Sonatype, Director of Security Intelligence for Akamai. Not sure. Yep. Okay. And a Senior Research Analyst and Strategy roles. He co-founded Rugged Software and IamCavalry to encourage new security approaches to security in response to the world's increasing dependency on digital infrastructure. His approach to security is to context of human factors, adversary motivations, and social impact has helped position him as one of the most trusted names in security. He is a adjunct faculty for Carnegie Mellon Hayes College and Cybersecurity Innovation Fellow for the Atlantic Council, and was a member of the Congressional Task Force for Healthcare Industry Cybersecurity. With that being said, Jackie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege for both of us to be here today. And although we have prepared slides and prepared comments, this is really meant to be a dialogue for all of you to ask us any questions that you want around information security, cybersecurity. So even if it's not something that we necessarily have a prepared comment about, we are happy to either answer the question or direct you to the right resources. You'll likely find that Josh and I have a lot of passion around this subject area, so we also might leverage acronyms and other things that perhaps we didn't explain as well as needed to understand. So please dialogue with us. We'll be watching the Q&A and we'll be happy to explain anything that we may think is a layperson term that actually isn't. So that being said, this slide just depicts the objectives of what we're hoping to achieve today and the focus areas that we want to talk about. I'm not going to read through the objectives. You can certainly read them on your own, but really meant to be a dialogue around cybersecurity and a lot of what we're seeing with respect to patient safety and risk. So this slide is a slide that depicts a lot. And really what it's meant to do is to show the various challenges that we currently face. And for those of you that are in healthcare, you probably already know this. We have a robust challenge in healthcare in the sense that we have a responsibility for patients' lives. And we also have the responsibility and accountability to manage legacy technology with advanced cybersecurity threats. And as you likely know, there is significant changes to those threats every single day, every single hour, every single second. There's a new type of threat just when we figure out how to protect the last threat that came forward. And so we have a challenging environment that we currently face, and that's much of what we're going to dialogue about today.
Yeah, and this is Josh from Eye on the Cavalry. When we formed the group, we recognized the tenuous balance that there is a promise and a peril to connected technology. And a lot of these moves to digitize medicine and telemedicine and consumer participation and lowering costs and increasing use of AI, while there's tremendous benefits that come from this, and we're very excited by those, we know that a single exotic death or cautionary tale could trigger a crisis of confidence in the public to trust otherwise superior technologies. So we desperately want for ourselves and our families to advance technology as quickly as possible. We just want to make sure that the trust we place upon that those innovations are well met and well deserved. And currently, in a lot of spots, they're not. So this is not a fear-based message. The cavalry was basically formed in recognition that the cavalry isn't coming. We didn't see a lot of folks coming to save us as we increasingly depended on connected technology in areas affecting public safety and human life. So in recognition of that, we're now up near 800 or so volunteer hackers and white hats trying to save lives through security research wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So it's trying to raise the alarm without being alarmist. But we have come to recognize through the task force that Jackie and I served on with 19 other world-class stakeholders is that we were always prone, we were always prey, we just lacked sufficient predator interest. And everything has changed, so that's going to necessitate that we too make changes. At the heart of all this is what we really want to make sure is the technologies and innovations we do should subordinate to the patients and the patient care delivery. They should be at the center of all this. And while the profession of healthcare delivery goes all the way back to the Hippocratic Oath and likely prior, technology is increasingly playing a role in the delivery of modern healthcare. And just look at these babies in a natal intensive care unit, but look again to how much technology and how many connected technology devices surround it. And we will likely come back to just the myriad of bedside infusion pumps that you see there that my group has been using in live ER clinical hacking simulations to take the intersection of actual hacking capability of real-world devices that have received FDA safety communications and recalls when they intersect with real human physiology. What are those intersections like? And can we do fire drills and simulations to prepare ourselves to spot these failures so that we can be best prepared to adapt in the face of them? And to punctuate this a bit, the very first meeting that Jackie and I had with the healthcare task force, we were asked to look at patient privacy in hyperconnected medicine. And for reasons we'll get to in a little bit, one of my first statements was, I love my privacy, but I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And I asserted that perhaps HIPAA and the HITECH Act had over-rotated on the confidentiality of patient healthcare information, maybe at the neglect of patient safety and the availability of life-saving resources. So we really took it upon ourselves not just to look at CIA or confidentiality, integrity, and availability and the regulated data that HHS and ONC and OCR track, but also resilient, reliable, available patient care delivery and patient safety. Jack.
So why are we protecting all of this? And as Josh mentioned, we're always trying to balance the various components, but in reality, it is about patient safety. If we're not keeping them safe, we don't have patient trust. and we have opportunities. And so we have a lot to take care of. We have patients, we have data, we have healthcare workers. And so all encompassing in healthcare, we have a lot of things to protect and a lot of things to manage. And with that, we're faced with significant risk of, as we mentioned, the legacy technology and all of the opportunities surrounding what an insider threat might create for us, which every day, regardless of all the protections we put in place, we're always worried about that one individual who could click a phishing link or that one individual who might leave their badge in the parking lot and create risk for us. So there's risk facing us really in every direction.
So cybersecurity is still a nascent field, and there's still a lot of cult of personality and untested hypotheses and theories, and even some of the regulatory regimes are incentivizing the use of practices that may not be the best way to do it. And while this is currently an emerging practice, it's not a new practice, but we are finally seeing adoption in healthcare of something that was developed first and foremost in the financial services sector. And that is, we are stumbling towards quantitative risk-based analysis that can speak in terms of the business and dollars and probabilistic models that may inform which assets we should protect from which risks and with which countermeasures. And ultimately, this is a risk management game. So FAIR is one of those models that I know some of the much larger health delivery organizations are using. I believe Jackie uses it quite well. But it is an emerging practice, one that when you see the tale of two cities or the tale of two healthcares that we talk about from our task force findings, this won't be available to everyone. But there are ways that can speak in the language of CFOs and the leadership and executive class of hospitals. And Jackie's making a fantastic use of that thus far.
Yeah, and I think what's most important about an analysis, whether it's FAIR or something more subjective, an evaluation, because not everybody has the resources, is really just that we're looking at this from a risk standpoint and we're focused on the highest risk areas, because we'll never be able to 100% protect an organization. We'll never be able to 100% fund it in such a way that you can say, we're 100% protected. We're never going to have a cyber issue. That's just not the reality of what we live in. And so I think it's really important to have the risk discussions, to talk about it in the context of program maturity and evaluate what is the organization's risk tolerance, what are we willing to take risk on, and what should we spend our biggest bang for our buck on, and really mitigating risk, all surrounding patient safety.
And while we're speaking to many executives and financial folks on this webinar, one important caveat is the number of people that are trained and qualified to use a FAIR quantitative model in healthcare is quite low at the moment. The good news is, as healthcare organizations do apply these practices, we can abstract directionality of where to apply the right controls within the healthcare context, because it's not one size fits all. The business models and attack surfaces may resemble parts of academia or financial services, but there are unique challenges even across hospitals. So I'm happy to see this starting, and you should seek it wherever you can find it. We just know that at the moment it would be really tough to hire a quantitative risk modeler for each of your healthcare delivery organizations. And the spread, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The spread is pretty wide for healthcare, especially because we don't have a large corpus of data yet on attacks. As I hinted before, we were always prone, we're always prey, but healthcare enjoyed a relative level of obscurity from the adversaries until somewhat recently. And everything's changed now. Not only have we attracted their attention, but we're also increasingly adding connectivity and telemetry and less trust zones between the information sharing in the name of precision medicine and 21st century cures and other things. So whether it's a high volume of low impact events, the frequency of which can add up to a lot of numbers, or whether it's a more exotic black swan, low probability, high impact event, we're now seeing single attacks measured in the millions of dollars for ransom, for example.
And I think, for the small hospital system who might be on this call, the small type of attack, it can be really expensive. It can add up. To give you some perspective of Sutter Health, we have over 1 trillion threats every single month. And, so that little minimum likelihood of something happening when somebody clicks on a link can add up really rapidly, because when it happens, it could potentially impact patient care. And it's at least at a minimum requiring us to remove devices that are used for patient care off our systems to make sure that it doesn't expose the rest of the system. So this is becoming the new norm, the minimum, not necessarily the maximum, but again, it adds up really quickly as to the cost.
Yep. And the lions and tigers and bears continue, right?
Yeah, this is just a depiction of, how it can impact and how quickly it happens. This isn't meant to be a scare factor. This is just meant to be the reality of what we're facing today.
Now, that relative obscurity I talked about, it's obvious that we always had valuable things for people to steal, but they just hadn't noticed. And now when you start to put some quantitative value to it on the black market, personal healthcare information is quite valuable. But even that doesn't capture the whole story, depending on the type of hospital you are. Perhaps you have, I live in New England, so there's a whole lot of research and development and intellectual property being developed in the Partners Health Group with all the various teaching hospitals. And the amount of intellectual property is an incredibly attractive target to nation state adversaries and even increasingly in the organized crime rings. So we are, in fact, quite a lucrative target, relatively high value assets with very relatively low or immature and nascent defense programs.
And really, the only thing that could be calculated is the medical record, the intellectual property that Josh mentions. That could be priceless, because it could be a patent, it could be, compounding a new drug that once that information is obtained, somebody else is going to replicate that.
In fact, I believe I haven't even read all the articles yet, but while we were at the world's largest cybersecurity conference, RSA conference last week in San Francisco, there were several stories about DNA and genetic mapping databases being compromised. So just think of not only the value of those, but while you can get a new credit card, you can't get new genetics. You can't get new DNA. And that's not just a compromise against you, but all your progeny.
So this slide just depicts the potential impact. As you can see, there's lots of potential impact. I happen to be in California, which is probably one of the most heavily regulated states. And so not only do we have to worry about ransomware issues, but when we have them, we actually have obligations in the state to report those and have potential regulatory implications. There's always a potential for litigation or a legal lawsuit attached to it, particularly if we lose a patient's data. And then we have risk of, third-party loss, patient safety, reputational harm, and then I'll just mention whistleblower loss. And really what I mean by that is somebody from within the organization, doesn't think you're investing significantly enough in privacy or security that creates some sort of a breach. If they share that with regulators, there's the potential for not only the regulators to come after you, but they also have whistleblower protections under federal and state law that allow them to collect some of the damages.
And while actuaries can do it, how do you put a price tag on the loss of life? And more importantly, as I tell the cavalry members, it's not the single death or handful of actual deaths. It's the follow-on retreat from otherwise superior technology. We're in the business of trying to improve healthcare, prolong the quality and duration of life, and any fear that gets in the way of that could be more harmful than the actual initial losses. So part of what we're advocating for, whether it's a risk-based approach or looking at the attack density and patterns or whatever level of prioritization we can do in the face of this new information, is we're really trying to introduce that just like we need to wash our hands and scrub in before surgery, we would never want to do open heart surgery with dirty hands or dirty instruments. The technology we use also requires a level of hygiene now of various types. So we both served on the Congressional Task Force for Healthcare Industry Cybersecurity, and just as luck would have it, that experience was quite challenging. In fact, I joke that the Healthcare Task Force was hazardous to our health, and that as a reward for aging quickly through the process and through the stress, perhaps we should get free healthcare for life. But just before our very first in-person meeting, one of my worst fears became manifest. It was, and perhaps you heard about it, and while the ransom was quite small, Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in LA had to shut down patient care for a week. It had to divert ambulances up the street in LA traffic. Imagine bleeding or needing to get to the hospital when seconds matter, and you have to go up the street in LA traffic to the nearest other facility. They had to cancel surgeries, postpone procedures to restore services. And if there's technologists on the call, my role at the time was trying to improve the cyber supply chain of software and add software nutrition labels or software ingredients lists to most safety critical things. We'll get to that again in a bit. But this was actually a single Java flaw in a single Java library called JBoss that happened to hit a single technology in the healthcare delivery environment. So a single flaw that they were warned about and said anyone who's using this version of JBoss should take steps to patch it, update it, or isolate it. And despite advance warning, the hospitals couldn't answer two simple questions. Am I affected? And where am I affected? And this was an entirely avoidable harm. And while the ransom actually ended up being quite a bit less than initial estimates, I think it was $17,000, the patient safety impact and the patient care availability was devastating to me, in part because as one of the few that researched the rise of hacktivism and Anonymous, I had been warning the federal government and the intelligence community about cyber terrorism. And in point of fact, a few months before this attack, the U.S. and allies killed the first cyber terrorist. He went by the handle of Trick, but Junaid Hussain left his Birmingham flat in the UK as a former honor student, moved to Raqqa, Syria, and started the cyber caliphate. And my very first thought upon seeing this Hollywood Presbyterian attack was, thank God Trick is dead. He was killed with a drone strike. But the reason being, if an accident can take out one hospital in LA, what could Trick do? What could someone with rudimentary hacking skills do? And I posed to the group, are there any technical barriers to a sustained denial of patient care on all hospitals? What if someone did this on purpose? And that really grounded us in the art of the possible and what the true mission was. And that's what took us past, I believe that's what took us past just HIPAA 2.0 and really focused on just how prepared are we for resilient and available patient care delivery. Now, this is one of the bookends. We'll get to the second in a few minutes. And SamSam did not hit as many hospitals as we could have, but it certainly woke up people to the possibility. Now, over the course of that year and a half, we won't make you read this whole thing. In fact, we have an over the 100-page report that we painstakingly wrote. I just want to call out that as a fairly risk-averse and careful task force, despite us not wanting to scare anybody, the unanimous title for our title graphic for the report was that healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition. And the five major contributors depicted here, the five uncomfortable truths among many, and I'm going to add some quantitative numbers to this stuff, but there is a severe lack of security talent within the healthcare delivery organizations. Our analysis showed 85% of the HDOs in the U.S. lack a single qualified security person on staff, not even one. There is no one defending these networks in a lot of cases. Larger organizations like Jackie's may have 20, 50, even over 100 in a team, but everyone in the small, medium, and rural categories were hard-pressed to find one. The The second real huge challenge is legacy equipment. It is not uncommon to find Windows XP or older things that have been deprecated. Their successors have been deprecated, and it is not just common to find XP, it is often the norm. Windows 7 has been end-of-lifed, and it's much harder, even if you had a sufficiently large team, to defend these older, indefensible, unpatchable systems in a lot of cases. But third, this is actually an unintended consequence of an otherwise good policy, the meaningful use requirements that tied reimbursement to the ability to receive and transmit electronic health records drove a level of premature and hyperconnectivity before it was merited. These devices that were never meant to be connected to anything now had a financial incentive to slap on connectivity to everything. And this leads to flat, unsegmented networks because the network connectivity is so brittle and device functionality has been encumbered by that brittleness. The fourth one was quite uncomfortable, which is that these are not just privacy violations, but these vulnerabilities can impact patient care. What we meant when we started writing this report was things like Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, where time-sensitive available care was not there. And then lastly, when looking at a swath of typical medical devices, it was not rare to have over 1,000 known security vulnerabilities per device. One particular research we cite here had 1,400 vulnerabilities in a single Pyxis device, just one. So let's tie those together. 85% of the healthcare in the U.S. lacks a single security person on staff to defend the network. They are defending indefensible things that are often over-connected to each other and reachable from the outside world. A single flaw in a single device can affect patient care, and a typical medical device gives you 1,000 or more chances to do so. So we were not comfortable with these facts, and this is now in our official report to Congress and HHS, and you can read all about the painstaking methods we use to get there, but this should give us great pause. Jackie, anything to add?
Nothing to add.
Okay. So one of my strongest recommendations, and I fought really hard for, and I've been a bit victorious, and Jackie also has a success story she will share, was this notion of a software bill of materials, or an SBOM. And without going into the gory details of this graphic from our Commerce Department, the task force asked for a software ingredients list for all medical technologies. Congress later agreed. House Energy and Commerce says, we love this. You cannot defend what you do not know you have. So we want to see a software ingredients list. HHS should go do that. Subsequently, the Food and Drug Administration has put it into their pre-market guidance for cybersecurity rules to bring brand new medical devices to market or submit 510K changes, which means going forward, a software bill of materials will allow you in hospitals to, in the procurement stage, determine better and worse hygiene amongst the people you're buying medical equipment from. During the operational lifespan, you can make sure you use the least vulnerable versions of those devices you procured. And you can have operational vigilance that if there is a new attack, like a heart bleed or a WannaCry or a Urgent 11, or the most recent one from Monday is Sentooth for Bluetooth Low Energy, you don't have to wonder, am I affected and where am I affected, or call dozens of vendors who can't give you answers. You could do a very quick check. So that software bill of materials idea, if you focus on the final goods assembled, is basically saying no one builds these technologies from whole cloth. They have a supply chain. All of us are in the supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. And we want every stakeholder to have a line of sight that when something's wrong anywhere, we can take action everywhere. So with that, the SBOM is moving along. In fact, the U.S. Commerce Department said to FDA, could we maybe work on a universal standard? If we come up with a standard that's useful to your regulatory mandate and timely, will you use it? And the FDA said yes. So we're in year 1.5 of the NTIA Commerce Department working groups. This is a graphic from that. And we have written documents on how procurement in hospitals can get significant benefit and choose the best supply of medical devices for long-term stability. When we get to insurers and underwriters and credit rating agencies later, they too are salivating at the idea of knowing which of the hospitals they insure have the best risk posture for their premiums. But then to bookend, as the ink was drying on our congressional report to Congress, our biggest fear came true, which is while SamSam was devastating, WannaCry affected 41% of the healthcare delivery in the UK and elsewhere, but probably most acutely in the UK. And this was a known vulnerability that had patches available. People did not know which systems needed to be patched and did not successfully or effectively patch in time. And the patient care delivery was severely affected internationally. What we found is stroke centers, for example, there were 0 stroke trauma centers open in London for the entirety of that Mother's Day weekend as our report was coming out. And if you know much about strokes, you have about 3 to 4 hours to preserve brain function and life. So time is very critical. And given that 0 stroke trauma centers were open, the probability of death and permanent brain damage was almost certain, given the high volume they typically have in an average weekend and the inability to service those people in a timely manner. So at the macro level, as I wrapped up time at the International Policy Think Tank, we were looking at what are the geopolitical and public safety implications. I know Jackie had much more acute anecdotes from her dealing with WannaCry, or at least preparing for it in the States.
Yeah, I think just to comment on WannaCry to the sort of the operational piece of this is we had 91,000 devices that needed to be patched in a short period of time to try to mitigate the potential impact. Because sometimes when we see things happen in the UK or other places, the next place they come to is the United States. It's not just a dead thing. And so that's what we are worried about. And despite all of the resources that I have available to me, it still took us 6 months to patch all of those 91,000 devices. And so during that period of time, we were absolutely running the risk of this happening to us and this impacting probably anybody in healthcare, just given those challenges. So it's a very real thing. And, we don't sleep at night because we have these kinds of worries.
And at least in the international policy context, I kept telling our community, in fact, I was in Israel for their Cyber Week in association with the government, and I was warning about how lucky we got with WannaCry and how it could have been much worse for the U.S. and for our partners in the international community. And during my 12-minute talk on stage, NotPetya, an even more devastating attack, hit and did over $1 billion of damage to Merck Pharmaceutical alone, and has really shocked the insurance and cyber physical systems worlds in numerous ways, including, while less covered, fairly traumatic impact on healthcare delivery, simply because of one of the victims being Nuance Software, the voice to dictation, almost near monopoly in voice dictation for doctor notes and orders and transcriptions. So while we don't have a specific slide for NotPetya, the volume and variety of these attacks can be very devastating. And I think both Jackie and I appear in the Sandworm book that talks about NotPetya in excruciating detail. So it's tough to say that just because we haven't been hit in the last few years doesn't mean we won't be. And often as a species, we need to burn our hand on the stove before we know it's hot. So one of the things that my group has done through I Am the Cavalry is we met some doctors, 2 doctors, who happen to also be hackers. They actually grew up hackers going to DEF CON, the largest hacker conference in the world. And then they later went to med school. So at their alma mater, University of Arizona, we did the world's first clinical ER hacking simulations, followed by tabletop simulations of ransomware attacks on a single hospital in the city or plural hospitals in the city to figure out when do things break and fall down, how hard do they fall down, are there backup plans? And there's a fairly decent 9-minute clip from ABC Nightline called Fear of Hackers that in a fairly artful and non-scare tactic-y way, cover just how realistic these scenarios are, where we did 3 different ER hacking simulations with actors and surgical dummies to see how patient care was affected, followed by a very large multi-stakeholder set of tabletop crisis simulations the following day. Things like logging in with a default password to the air conditioning and building automation system. What effect might that have if we lock them up for a ransom? And at least in Arizona, it turns out no air conditioning means you need to evacuate the buildings pretty quickly in 117-degree heat, and perishables go bad pretty quickly. But also, to my stunned surprise, no elevators meant no surgeries, because their surgical floors were seldom on the ground floor. And other assumptions that have been told to Congress time and time again, such as, we'll just fall over to paper records. The very first step the head of the hospital did was order people to fail over to paper printouts of the medical records, to which his deputy said, "Sir, we can't do that." And he looked angry and said, "Why can't we do that? We print them out all the time." And he said, "Sir, we stopped training our med students on them 6 years ago. No one's ever seen one." So it was an incredibly valuable thing that Sarbanes-Oxley already requires for disaster recovery, business continuity, crisis management simulations. We've been tailoring these through the banner of Cyber Med Summits, now hosted out of UCSD. But these have been really palpable and visceral opportunities to learn and test our assumptions for how prepared we are for fairly easy to execute disruption of operations or clinical environments. So we wanted to put these ideas out there because if it's just a focus on HIPAA or information security officers designated or qualified, that's one thing. But Jackie, what's hygiene historically meant when we're talking about the clinical environment?
Yeah, so historically, hygiene is related to how we're washing our hands. And as Josh mentioned earlier, we would not go into a surgery without proper hygiene. So from our vantage point, when we're looking at cybersecurity, we're looking at from the same vantage point as, we have all of this technology, we have artificial intelligence, we have all these great things that provide our ability to, deliver really great care. But we've done that without contemplating the basic layer of cyber hygiene that we need and should not be deploying the technology without having it. Because in reality, if we're doing that, it's like not washing your hands and going into performing that surgery. And the risk, as we've talked about throughout these slides, is pretty high that there's going to be an issue because we haven't contemplated it.
And while I'm going to say something uncomfortable, beyond the operational hygiene, usually cyber hygiene is heard as, do we have firewall rules? Do we have antivirus running on our desktops? Do we set up network security to keep the bad guys out? It's more about the operational plumbing. We've worked through the task force and through directly changing FDA guidelines to basically point out the devices themselves need a certain minimum level of hygiene and care. And there are some very pervasive false beliefs, like you can't patch medical devices, or even though the FDA has clarified that medical device makers claim you're not allowed to patch, which is either a willful lie or at least dated information. And in these cases, while we don't believe it's economically feasible to rip out everything you have, just to put this in context, it takes about 7 years to go from deciding to make a new medical device, building it, going through clinical trials, and achieving FDA certification to bring it through pre-market. The guidance is not yet 7 years old, so it'll be another year or two before the very first enlightened era actually comes to market. So while a few device manufacturers had a hunch that cybersecurity and cyber hygiene, things like being patchable, things like safety by design, things like separation and isolation and fail-safe modes, some of them started before their obligatory regulatory commands. But we are still in the dark ages of pre-regulatory guidance for most of the technology you depend upon. And we know that people say it works and we're going to keep using it. We have finite resources. We're empathetic to that. But we also know that we want to shift from legacy, unpatchable, unsafe devices towards relatively safer and more defensible ones as much as possible, as fast as possible. And to do so, it's going to take some pretty elegant plans on which devices need replacing the soonest, which ones can wait later, and that can be a risk-based approach. Jackie?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about this, I think, in the context of these slides, but I think it's important to just highlight that as healthcare organizations, we have to invest in cybersecurity. We have to see it as critical as hand washing. And as Josh mentioned, we can take a risk-based approach and identify the highest risk and take investments in there, but it's both a people and infrastructure thing. So, we have to have at least some level of talent to be able to inform each organization with respect to what are the risks and what do we need to do about them. And then, of course, the infrastructure piece of it. We are notorious in healthcare for holding on to legacy technology forever. I think Josh mentioned Windows XP. We have things much older than Windows XP and mostly used for biomed devices. So they're technology used to provide patient care. And so those are the hard conversations that have to happen as healthcare organizations to, really focus on can we protect this old technology? And if we can't, then can we get it on a plan to phase it out? Even if it takes 5 years, it's better than not phasing it out, 10 or 15 years later. So it's really, really important. And I think a lot of the folks that we know are on this webinar are the financial individuals. And I find it really helpful in my organization to partner with our financial experts to help me encapsulate not only the risk and calculation of risk, but what is the cost savings over time if we don't have a cyber issue that impacts patient care. And so I think that's an area where you can really help your security expertise or your designee in really making the business case to the organization on really investing in cybersecurity to some degree.
One of the, I helped drive the medical device sub-working group within our task force. And one of the things we really struggle with is these devices were really just never built for long-term use. You have a mismatch between the durable goods, how long the durable good could last. Maybe it's a multi-million-dollar laser. On the one hand, right, we want to use that for as long as possible. On the other hand, the software that runs on that is meant to live for 5 to 7 years. So how do you ever have a safe and reliable connected technology when the durable goods have a disparate lifespan from the ephemeral software that runs them? And we've challenged academia and government and ARPA and others to do alternative reference architectures so that maybe these devices have an expectation of having plural operating systems over their lifetime or they're future-proofed. And the devices you're currently dependent upon just never factored for that. So we, again, have significant empathy for that. But with great connectivity comes great responsibility. And we've tried to take part of that, just a hint at what risk-based modeling might look like. In that NICU baby photo we had earlier, one of the ideas we contemplated was a cash for clunkers program with the federal government or even private sector led, where perhaps we targeted our most pervasive technologies like bedside infusion pumps that have the ability to empty the full contents of a drug, a lethal dose of a drug, directly into the patient. So maybe we take our least safe, most pervasive, lower price point technologies and we create an incentive to do a buyback program, much like we did with automobiles that were less safe and worse for emissions. And at least in the high level discussions about that, one of the things that came up was some of the nurses said some of these older bedside infusion pumps may work, but the amount of attention they require to constantly reset, reboot, turn off, turn on, futz with, the newer models are significantly easier, more reliable, and improve their productivity. So it was our hunch that some device types, if we tried a small experiment, in many cases, it may actually improve the hospital's experience and the operational costs to have newer and better and more reliable technology. But these are the kind of conversations that are multi-stakeholder and would involve your participation. And that is one of the task force recommendations that Congress thought had the most promise, but has yet to have a pilot done. Perhaps you could be part of that pilot.
I think, Josh, the other area that we haven't mentioned yet is just talking about insurance.
Right.
And lots of organizations can get cyber insurance. I would say the vetting process from 10 years ago to today to actually get some kind of cyber insurance coverage is much different, much more robust. The questions that they're asking feels like they take us through an entire privacy and security assessment, really on the program, providing proof. But do you also want to mention what you've been hearing with respect to some of the exclusions?
Yeah, so I think insurance is still a very small book of revenue for most of the global insurers. They had policies that are coarsely grained, and we didn't have a lot of loss events, so they were allowed to stay that way. And they didn't want to price things so high that no one would buy it. What has happened, though, is given the relative obscurity I just referred to that healthcare had enjoyed, a lot of people had insurance covered for their ransoms for quite some time, often under insurance premiums that had nothing to do with cybersecurity. Sometimes it would be directors and officers. Sometimes it would be extortion. Sometimes it would be kidnapping. And these vague, overarching policies, now that they have been paid out and the payouts are increasing in count and in size, the insurance companies, of course, have a knee-jerk reaction and they adapt. So I spent a significant portion of last year working with AIG and other large insurers who are starting to ask which questions should we use to determine if someone is coverable and what the maximum payout should be, and if there's risk bands and T-shirt sizes that we can assess from the outside. And it's not just the insurers. Moody's, for example, also spent significant time with me and other members of the task force to come up with their guidance now on credit rating scores. So imagine if your hospital wants to borrow, your credit rating materially affects your financial outlook. And they have put out guidance, I think, in around September, October of last year on how they look at relative risk. And the kind of things they're going to be looking for is which percentage of your IT and your clinical technology stack has had a FDA safety communication or recall without mitigation. So if you're one of those hospitals that has ignored the 10 or so medical device recalls for cybersecurity, as so many have done, that is now something that the insurers will pay attention to. Another might be, do you have segmentation and isolation, or are you one big, flat, wide open network, which is unfortunately why a single flaw in a single device often takes out an entire hospital, because we lack proper segmentation and isolation. So what might have been covered in insurance last year is unlikely to be covered or coverable maybe next year or the year after. And your relative hygiene may affect your relative ability to borrow or invest capital in your expansions of the larger networks. And those are just but a few, but that software bill of materials I referred to as well, those are going to start to add to transparency and visibility of which medical device makers are relatively good and bad risks for these insurers, underwriters, and creditors to take their own secondary actions. We're also having other fruits from our task force, like Jackie has introduced with Stark's Law. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, just briefly, I'll mention Stark and anti-kickback. For those of you who are not familiar, the Stark and anti-kickback are laws that most states who can't employ their physicians have to comply with, and it really has to do with the relationship between the physicians and that organization. And there's analysis that has to be done. And one of the challenges that it precludes is, for example, we know that independent physician groups who are, for example, affiliated with Sutter don't have as good of cyber hygiene as Sutter Health does. They can't afford to. They often are donated the EHR from the big systems because we want to be interconnected with them for our patients. And it's a challenge because I want them to have as good a security controls as we have, because if they don't and they're connected to us, it creates just as much risk as my workforce member clicking a link. And so one of the things that was recommended as a part of the task force is getting an exception to Stark and Anna kickback to be able to provide them not only the electronic health record, which is currently an exception, but also have the opportunity to provide them the cybersecurity software that larger organizations are lucky to be able to afford and deploy to protect patients. And so I'm pretty excited about that. It's closed for comment now, but we're expecting hopefully yet this year a final regulation with that exception. And I know for Sutter Health that will be significant because we're affiliated with more than 5,000 independent physicians. And so the opportunity to provide them the same cybersecurity software that I currently use for Sutter will be huge in protecting both the physicians and the patients from a cyber issue. Yeah.
Now, some of the other things we know are on the horizon to be asked for by insurers, underwriters, credit rating scoring, and increasingly even patients are things like, do you have a qualified security professional on staff? How large is your team? Things like, have you performed an annual or semi-annual tabletop crisis simulation on ransomware? We saw one of the questions here is, do people insure against ransomware? And I think I partially answered that. But those insurance coverage topics were not custom built for ransomware. And in the time frame from which they've been paid out, they went from $17,000 for a loss event to $4 or more million in some cases. And if you've been paying attention, there are healthcare delivery organizations in the Midwest that have been out for weeks and weeks and have the nearest available hospital over an hour and a half away. So this is starting to scare them. And one thing I did not mention, but should, is these lawsuits that are popping up between the insurers and the insured after the NotPetya attacks that took out Merck Pharmaceutical, Maersk Global Shipping, which is 20% of global shipping into ports, Nuance software that likely affected hospitals like Jackie's and your own. After that, the Cadbury chocolate parent company, Mondelez, was denied their insurance coverage that they paid for by Zurich. And there's now a lawsuit. Zurich was essentially claiming that NotPetya, being cyber munitions from Russia, was an act of war and therefore should be excluded. Now, if this lawsuit pans out to exclude their coverage, faith in the coverage of these attacks and insurance will go plummeting. And if they aren't going to add restrictions, the payouts will be unacceptable and unpalatable. So we're in a state of punctuated equilibrium and volatility from really large, devastating attacks, testing our prior assumptions about insurance, insurability, payouts, and restrictions. And now they're starting to look at what are the minimum hygienes. So sure, we'll give you driver's insurance, but it doesn't count if you're driving drunk, if you're ignoring FDA recalls, for example. So if the harm comes from avoidable, known, publicized flaws, that's going to be treated significantly differently. And while we don't expect you to be experts on these new developments, this is an opportunity to at least hint at the directionality of some of those. We don't think insurance will go away, but it may be more specific, have greater prerequisites or exit clauses than it did last year. So as we pivot, it's going to take a village to raise this child. It's not going to be a single cybersecurity hero. The organizations we've found that do the best, they understand the role of the CFO, the role of the CMO, the role of patient advisory and biomed services. Jackie's considered one of the top executives for balance and ambassador translator work within her environment. But we need you on this call to play a part. You're either going to be the one saying yes or no, or driving quantitative risk or ignoring it. And that's why we want to make ourselves available today to answer your questions, and whether they're in the content we've provided or in net new questions that you can ask in a consequence-free place with some friendlies like us. Anything else, Jackie?
No, that's it.
I'm not a big fan of capes, but that was our only quibble over this slide. No capes. So with that, this is how you can reach us after the fact. But we have had the question and answer open this whole time. Perhaps now is a good time for you to jump in and ask your questions.
Okay. Wow. You said 85% of the HDOs lack a single qualified security person. Can you say more? I thought HIPAA required an information security officer.
It does, and that was probably my biggest moment of heart attack during the entire task force. I think we were 50% of the way through, and we had the privilege of meeting with one of the top information security officers in a smaller rural hospital. She flew up from, I believe, Florida to HHS for an in-person meeting, and we talked about, why she was so successful and lessons we could learn. And we found out that she was the head nurse and the accountant and the ISO, our information security officer. And we also found out that she had never had any training at all. She learned most of her things from reading the SANS Storm Center blog and was asking us for a 3-day boot camp. And that is not for a moment to denigrate the accomplishments and the value she was offering both to her hospital and her peer groups. It was that our biggest aha was we believed that those ISOs had a minimum training level or background. The minimum certification in our field is called CISSP, and to even take the test, which is quite extensive, usually takes about a year of practice and training and reading materials, but also requires 5 years of full-time on-the-job experience before being allowed to take it. So the notion that one of the best in the country couldn't do, wanted a 3-day boot camp instead of this. I joked at the time, and I almost regret how I said it, but that, we have a shortage of heart surgeons too. Can I have a 3-day boot camp for heart surgery? And of course, they're not apples to apples levels of training required. But what was revealed to us through the process is the ISOs are designated ISOs, and they often have one or more other day jobs. So while you can meet the HIPAA requirement, those were not necessarily going to make you capable of ingesting the threat intelligence sharing that we were also asking Congress to streamline, or to act on the emergency patches when there's a WannaCry, or to interpret the software bill of materials that we're fighting to get added. So the survey data that we have, which we cite in the task force report, shows the number of small, medium, rural, and large hospitals. And small, medium, and rural constitute about 85%, for pretty steady for the last several years prior. And we couldn't find security professionals in those environments except for very rare cases.
Okay. You mentioned that the FDA has done recalls for cybersecurity and that hospitals have not sufficiently acted. Can you give an example?
Yeah, there are a few. The first, the groundbreaking one was the Hospira bedside infusion pump. The previous stance from the FDA was that until there was proof of harm, they weren't going to take a regulatory action. Through work of I Am the Cavalry and teaching each other our disparate lingo, we got them to the point where they realized an unmitigated pathway to harm was sufficient. And since this device was both hackable and unpatchable, the Safety Communication went out saying hospitals should cease using this and should procure their newer device coming out in 6 months or an alternative. By and large, those have not been acted upon. In fact, my very own hospital, I took my daughter to the emergency room during WannaCry with the graded and delayed patient care that Mother's Day weekend. Was still using that almost 2 years later. And then a following year later, my hospital is still using it during my surgery the following Christmas. So we have basically heard that hospitals will use this until it stops working, and that they believe there's no reason to update these things. The insurers and the liability people feel very differently, but that's just one of those things where I think until there's an exotic, high-profile attack, the attempts we've made to warn people and at least get these devices segmented onto different networks so they're not on the naked flat network of the hospital have largely been ignored. There's been about 10 recalls, but to make one a little more contrasted, there was also a recall of 750,000 pacemakers because of a 3-digit hard-coded passcode that could allow harm. The device maker was St. Jude Medical. Abbott had acquired them. FDA and Abbott put out a recall. There's a safe patch and update, and There have been medical journal fights between the physicians I work with and a couple others on whether you should or shouldn't patch them. And these are known weaknesses with a viable, safe fix that can be done in the safety of the clinical environment. Risk calculations can be done for really, really high risk patients, but cardio professionals currently believe they should not apply those patches. So we are trying to temper the experience gaps in the two worlds and teach each other more, in part through these clinical ER hacking simulations. But by and large, I believe most of the FDA recalls have not been acted on in the last 4 years or so since the first one.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I'm going to ask at this time if you or Jackie have any closing remarks.
Jackie?
None from me, other than that we're here to help. So please feel free to reach out with any questions or dialogue with us, or if you want your security professionals at your organization to dialogue with us, we're always happy to help and support the industry.
Yeah, I would say that there's an army of folks willing to help, and groups like I Am the Cavalry, like the Biohacking Village, like the CyberMed Summit have teamed with the FDA, with Congress, with a lot of the information sharing and analysis organizations, the ISACs and ISAOs. And our goal is not to be a pointing finger, but rather to be a helping hand. We want the promise of connected technology. We want to limit the peril, and we believe that'll most happen if you test your preparedness before harm with things like these clinical hacking simulations. So please watch that ABC Nightline video called Fear of Hackers. Maybe take a look at the Cavalry's Hippocratic Oath for Connecting Medical Devices. This was a document we wrote to help the regulators get their feet under them on what things should be required, but also for patients and hospitals to know what types of technologies, if they were to do future procurement or future dependence, would be more dependable. So that's at iamthecavalry.org/oath. Again, iamthecavalry.org/oath. And the idea was to marry the language that doctors, physicians, and caregivers already care about, and to just recognize that technology increasingly plays a role in the delivery of patient care, and maybe our technologies should support that symbolic pathos and creed and intent of the Hippocratic Oath. So we want to be safer sooner. We believe we can do that together, and I look forward to helping in any capacity. I'm sure Jackie and the other task force members would be as well. Thank you.
Okay. We have reached the conclusion of today's webinar presentation. I would like to thank our speakers for presenting this very timely presentation. We hope you found the presentation informative. Please remember to complete the online evaluations within 2 days after the webinar. Your feedback is important and helps plan future programs. If you have further questions about this webinar, you may email them to HFMA's Resource Center at resourcecenter@hfma.org. Our Resource Center staff will assist with questions not answered during the webinar. Be sure to sign up for upcoming webinars via our website at hfma.org. Thank you for the presentation, participating, and have a great day.